First, we've got population. Now, the world today has 6.8 billion people. That's headed up to about 9 billion. Now, if we do a really great job on new vaccines, healthcare, reproductive health services, we could lower that by perhaps 10 or 15%. So in the next 5 to 10 years, for the next pandemic, we'll solve all those problems.
You say the next pandemic, there will be another pandemic.
Absolutely. We don't know when. You know, the risk per year, 2%, 3%. So we'll have to prepare for the next one. That, I'd say is, will get attention this time. The pandemic, sadly, was fairly predictable, and it won't be the last pandemic. The next one could be far more severe. I had predicted there was a risk of a pandemic, and sadly, that came true.
The brand new Epstein files show that they may have planned the whole thing from the get-go. These documents prove that the infrastructure needed to profit from a major global pandemic had already been meticulously planned years before COVID-19. It exposes a massive financial system designed around pandemics that was quietly running long before the world ever shut down. Furthermore, it also shows many of the key players who were involved. Through an extensive review of these newly released documents, investigative journalist Sayed G has exposed a hidden network which directly connects Bill Gates, Jeffrey Epstein, and a host of other extremely powerful individuals. It places Epstein front and center, revealing the instrumental role he played in orchestrating the connections, brokering the deals, and guiding the strategic decisions, also that Gates and his friends could plan for future pandemics years ahead of time. So the trail of evidence starts in 2011, with internal emails from JP Morgan Bank showing that Jeffrey Epstein helped design the financial apparatus, which would later go on to secure over $100 million in funding for the Gates Foundation. So in these emails, Epstein was advising the bank's most senior executives on how to pitch a Gates-anchored donor fund, specifically for the purpose of bringing in investment for vaccines. Now, this would of course be masquerading as a charitable project, but was in fact designed to generate massive profits. Indeed, it set up a permanent pipeline where massive amounts of money could flow into vaccine development under the cover of philanthropy. Now, by this time, Bill Gates was already heavily invested in vaccine development, though according to Epstein was terribly frustrated. This was because the Gates Foundation had, quote, already spent billions, yet there was little that could be held up as a great success. And Epstein was right. Gates had already had a long history with vaccine development, dating back to the early 2000s. However, his efforts were already being met with controversy and criticism. This was particularly true regarding the mass distribution of vaccines throughout the Third World, which were later found to cause widespread infertility. It's also true of the grand promises of disease eradication through specialized new vaccines, which in many cases actually made the problem worse. Now, it's also worth noting that Gates himself is on record, proudly proclaiming the vaccines could successfully reduce the global population by a significant amount.
The world today has 6.8 billion people. That's headed up to about 9 billion. Now, if we do a really great job on new vaccines, healthcare, reproductive health services, we could lower that by perhaps 10 or 15%.
And indeed, it's phrases like this which really make you wonder about his intentions. But when we fast forward just 2 years into the future, this vaccine funding project that him and Epstein were colluding on would finally materialize. So in 2013, the Gates Foundation went on to create a special investment structure, which they called the Global Health Investment Fund. On the face of it, it allowed private investors to inject money into drug and vaccine development for the stated purpose of improving global health. In return, investors would bring in steady returns between 5 and 7%. Nothing too strange there. However, the key difference and what made this unusual was that these investors were offered a 60% guarantee of principal. And what does that mean? It means that private investors would only be risking a maximum of 40% of their original investment if things didn't go well. well, of course. The other 60% loss, well, that would be covered by the Gates Foundation and its partners, using philanthropic and public money. Now, in plain words, private investors got to keep most of the profits if things went well, but they were mostly protected from the biggest risks by charity and taxpayer-backed money. And why is this significant? Because this setup basically turned global health issues like pandemics into seriously profitable business opportunities, all with low risk. It means that there was now a real incentive to pump massive funds into these kinds of projects, and it also laid the groundwork for everything that followed later on. However, Epstein's role in this story doesn't end there. Over the years, he continued to expand Gates' influence in the field of pandemic preparedness. Furthermore, the financial foundation from 2011 quietly paved way for something much bigger. And with the money pipeline now secured, the next phase was turning those resources into actual global governance. Fast forward just 2 years to 2015, documents show that the Gates Foundation was already in active discussions with several other groups about pandemics and global responses. This was way ahead of any outbreak. Many of those groups overlapped with the International Peace Institute, which in that same year proposed a high-level expert convening in Geneva, and the topic of focus was how to most effectively address and prevent pandemics. Now, although the Gates Foundation publicly declined to fund the event, it went ahead anyway and was hosted by its president, Rod Larson. This meeting involved major groups like the Director General of the World Health Organization, the World Bank, MSF International President, and senior UN and global health officials. Now, it's worth noting that this guy Larson already knew Gates personally. In fact, he'd been dining with him at Jeffrey Epstein's residence just 2 years prior. And so therefore, it's highly possible that they were at least somewhat ideologically aligned by that point. And even after the funding refusal, Epstein managed to keep the personal channel with Larson open. He did this by forwarding Gates' article on pandemic preparedness. And so what this basically shows is that Epstein was acting as a sort of back-channel intermediary. He was trying to spread Gates' influence and help align ideas on pandemics across many different institutions. And so we know that the elite were already aligning on pandemic governance years ahead, but the real shift happened in 2017. This was when the language changed completely. See, in their communications, Epstein and others within Gates' inner circle were now openly discussing pandemics as though they were business opportunities. Pandemics were now treated as a standing category, just like any other investment. Energy, tech, construction. In other words, the concept of a pandemic was no longer seen as a rare disaster. Rather, these were now events that could be predicted, planned for, and potentially manufactured to turn into massive sources of revenue and resource acquisition. Furthermore, during this time, Epstein was also brokering specialists directly into Gates' office for the specific purpose of simulating pandemics. One example is a text thread from Epstein's phone with an unidentified physician who cites their work experience with the United Nations, the World Health Organization, the Gates Foundation, and the World Bank. This doctor specifically mentions pandemic simulation as a key career credential, and in response to this, Epstein directly recommends to connect with Bill Gates. Now, this shows that these guys weren't merely interested in pandemics as a hypothetical. No, they were investing heavily in actual simulations, like they were preparing for something that they knew was going to happen in the near future. And coincidentally, that same year, the World Bank launched the first ever pandemic emergency financing facility. This was the first of its kind pandemic catastrophe fund, which supplied $320 million in bonds to be sold off to private investors. Of course, it just so happens that coronaviruses were explicitly named as one of the covered risks in those bonds. So the timing here is really quite striking and also very convenient. Now, at the very least, it suggests that these institutions were already planning, at least financially, for a coronavirus-style outbreak, at least 3 years in advance. Now, when you put all of this together, what came next is almost impossible to overlook. In October 2019, just 6 weeks before COVID even appeared, the world saw a full-scale rehearsal, and Event 201 took place. Event 201 was a major pandemic simulation exercise, specifically modeled on a novel coronavirus. It was co-hosted by the Johns Hopkins Center for Health Security, the World Economic Forum, and of course, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. And what did they do? Its main focus was looking at how to shape government policy during a viral outbreak, how drug supplies would be distributed, how to shape media coverage, public health messaging, how to handle and limit social media posting, how to force members of the general public to comply with rules and regulations, and how countries would need to work together in a unified response. Now, does this feel like a coincidence to you? Or is something far more deliberate going on? I mean, how is it even possible to rehearse the exact scenario 6 weeks before it even happens? By this time, everything was in place. The money, the simulations, the network, the tech. 6 weeks later, the real thing begins. Now, although these documents are not proof, they don't provide definitive proof, when you factor in all of the other evidence, ranging from the pre-held patents, coronavirus, the mRNA vaccine technology, spike proteins, the millions in dollars of funding going towards gain-of-function research, it really is starting to look like the whole thing might have been planned from the start. This network had already built the financial tools, the policy blueprints, the pandemic simulations, the vaccine patents, the elite connections needed to respond to and profit from a major global outbreak. It involved Epstein, Bill Gates, major financial institutions, many others. The money was there, the rehearsals had happened, the coronaviruses were already flagged. Key players were already aligned years in advance. I mean, this isn't a theory, these are literally documented events. And so, at the very least, this timeline raises extremely serious questions. Now, if even after all of the accumulated evidence that has come out in the past 5 years that highlights there were some real serious nefarious players involved and the narrative that we were fed about COVID was not accurate, even if all of that evidence has not convinced you, then you need to be asking yourself a very simple question. Whenever something like this happens on the world stage, to identify who the culprit really is, you just ask a simple question. Ask yourself who benefits. And if you do that, things become more clear.